On Christmas Eve, a tired Latina waitress kept a small diner open just a little longer and pulled a freezing old woman out of a blizzard, never knowing she was sheltering someone a billionaire could never afford to lose. Sofia Morales only saw lips gone bluish, hands shaking like brittle leaves, and eyes that kept darting toward the door as if the storm itself had a face. She didn't think about rewards or secrets or consequences that could reach her tiny apartment and snap her life in half. She simply moved on instinct, the kind her mother had taught her back when warmth was something you made, not something you bought. And in that first merciful minute, she unknowingly stepped into a story that had been waiting for her all along. The little diner breathed with low heater hum and the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic, while the windows blurred under wind-driven snow like frosted glass. Christmas garlands drooped above the booths, red bows glowing under warm pendant lights that tried their best to pretend the world outside was gentle. Sofia had been counting down the final minutes of her shift, dreaming of quiet and a bed, telling herself she'd lock up as soon as the coffee pot cooled. Then the door chimed, and an elderly woman staggered in as if she'd been pushed forward by the storm, coat soaked, hair iced, knees threatening to fold. The air seemed to tighten around her, and the whole room felt suddenly smaller, as if it had become a shelter by accident. Sofia didn't hesitate, because what she did next wasn't about money or pride, it was about dignity. Plain and simple. She guided the woman into a booth near the heater, pulled a grey blanket from the back room, and wrapped it around her shoulders with careful hands. In the kitchen she found soup still warm, and when she set it down, steam rose between them like a quiet promise that the night could still be kind. The woman's fingers trembled around the bowl, and her breath came in thin little puffs that made Sofia's chest ache. Sofia leaned close and told her she was safe here, that she wouldn't be left alone, not tonight. The front door slammed open so hard, the bell above it rang out like an alarm, and a violent gust flung snow across the checkered floor. A man stepped inside in a tailored dark suit that looked untouched by weather, his hair neat, his posture sharp, as if the blizzard had no permission to delay him. He didn't glance at the decorations or the empty counter, only at the booth where the old woman sat bundled like a frightened child. His eyes found Sofia, and the way he looked at her wasn't curiosity. It was assessment, like she was an obstacle that could be moved. When he spoke, he didn't ask. He demanded names and explanations with the calm authority of someone used to the world answering. Sofia felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, the old ache of knowing some people expect obedience the moment they sense you have less. Still, she planted herself between him and the booth, shoulders squared, voice steady, refusing to step aside just because his shoes were expensive and his tone was final. Behind her, the old woman made a small sound, half gasp, half prayer, and her eyes locked on the man with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold. The spoon in her hand stopped moving, as if time itself had been ordered to freeze, and Sofia sensed that this was not a stranger arriving for help. In that heavy, heated silence, she understood that the storm had followed the woman inside, and it had just learned Sofia's name. When the door finally swung shut again, the diner seemed to exhale, but the warmth didn't return the way it should have. The bells above the entrance stopped trembling, and the only sound left was the heater's tired hum and a faint rattle of ice against the window. Snow melted into tiny dark beads on the checkered floor where the wind had thrown it, like footprints from something unwelcome. Sofia kept her palms open at her sides, steadying herself the way she did when customers got loud and cruel. Across from her, the man in the tailored suit stood perfectly still, as if silence was something he owned. She glanced back at the old woman, whose shoulders curled inward beneath the blanket like a bird trying to hide its heart. The soup sat untouched now, steam thinning into the air, cooling faster than it should have in that drafty tension. The woman's hands were still wrapped tight around the bowl, not drinking, not eating, only holding on as if warmth could be stolen. Her eyes kept flicking from Sofia to the man, and each time they landed on him, the fear sharpened, turning older and deeper than a blizzard. Sofia leaned slightly toward her, careful, protective, placing her own body like a quiet wall between them. The man's gaze swept over the diner with the same cold precision as his entrance, noticing everything and caring about none of it. He looked at Sofia's apron, the name tag, the simple booth, like he was measuring how little she mattered in his world. His voice stayed low, controlled, yet every word carried an edge that demanded obedience rather than understanding. Sofia answered with politeness that had steel beneath it, offering no more than necessary, refusing to let her tone become small. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she kept her face calm because panic was exactly what power expected. The old woman finally whispered something, almost swallowed by the heater and the storm, a name that sounded like a memory bruised by time. It wasn't a greeting, and it wasn't relief. It was a warning dressed as breath, as if speaking it could summon consequences. Her fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles whitening, and Sofia saw a faint discoloration on the fragile wrist beneath the fabric. The man's jaw flexed at the sound, and for a fraction of a second his polished control wavered like a cracked mirror. Sofia recognized that flicker, not as kindness, but as something restrained, something practiced. In that thin, stretched silence, Sofia made a choice that felt both simple and dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might hold or might break. She would not hand this woman over to fear just because a man in a suit said he belonged to her. She drew a slow breath and kept her stance steady, letting the diner's warm lights frame her resolve like a small, stubborn candle. The storm outside was loud, but it was honest, and this new chill in the room wore a human face. Sofia realized, with a tightening in her chest, that the old woman wasn't trembling because she'd been lost in the snow. She was trembling because she'd been found. Sofia kept her face calm, but inside her thoughts raced the way they always did when life pushed too hard. She had learned, long before this night, how to swallow fear without letting it show, because fear never paid the rent and never softened anyone's cruelty. Her mother used to say that dignity was like a candle in a drafty room. You had to shield it with your hands, even when your fingers burned. In Sofia's pocket, her phone pressed against her thigh, like a reminder of bills, overdue notices, and a landlord who didn't care about December kindness. Yet she stood there anyway, rooted in the narrow aisle of the diner, as if her body alone could keep a fragile life from being claimed. She had come to this city with nothing but a suitcase, a borrowed winter coat, and the stubborn belief that good people still existed. The diner became her second home, not because it was glamorous, but because it was predictable. Hot coffee, warm plates, and faces that returned when the world felt too big. She knew the regulars' stories the way she knew the menu, and she knew which ones needed a smile more than they needed change back. The owner trusted her with closing because Sofia treated the place like it mattered, like it was more than a job. Tonight she had stayed open just a little longer because the storm felt personal, the kind that trapped the unlucky and erased them quietly. As she watched the old woman's hands tremble around the cooling bowl, Sofia's mind flickered to the small apartment she'd returned to, faded curtains, a thrift store sofa, and a framed photo of her mother, smiling like sunlight. That photo was her anchor on nights when the world seemed sharp, a reminder that kindness wasn't weakness, it was inheritance. Sofia could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to be careful, to protect her heart, but never to let it turn cold. She had promised herself she would survive without becoming hard, even when customers snapped, even when managers talked down, even when she counted coins, insolence. In that promise lived her pride, quiet and fierce, the kind no suit could purchase. The old woman shifted under the blanket, and for a moment the fabric slipped back from her wrist, revealing a faint bruise like a thumbprint of control. Sofia's breath caught before she could stop it, and she leaned closer, pretending to adjust the blanket just to see more clearly. The skin was thin, fragile, marked in a way that didn't belong to a simple fall in the snow, and Sofia felt something heavy settle behind her ribs. Then her eyes dropped to the woman's hand, an expensive ring, unmistakably fine, catching the diner's neon glow as if it had wandered in from a different world. Wealth didn't usually arrive shaking and alone, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. Sofia glanced up at the man in the suit, and the cold certainty in his posture suddenly looked less like concern and more like possession. Sofia's gaze flicked to the woman's coat, to the way the buttons were fastened wrong, to the hurried, panicked mess of someone who hadn't dressed herself calmly. The old woman's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but her throat seemed locked by fear, and her eyes kept pleading toward Sofia instead of toward the man who claimed authority. Sofia realized the storm outside might be the least of it, that whatever had driven this woman into the blizzard had followed her right through the door. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, not as a gesture of comfort now, but as if she were holding on to evidence. And in the warm glow of Christmas lights, Sofia understood with a sudden chill that the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the weather. It was the reason Evelyn had run. Julian Hart gave his name the way some men gave commands, smooth, certain, and meant to end questions before they formed. He stepped farther into the diner, as if the blizzard outside was only background noise, his coat barely dusted with snow, his posture untouched by urgency. The warm Christmas lights caught the edge of his watch and cufflinks, little flashes of a world that didn't count pennies or pray for tips. He didn't look at the soup or the blanket or the trembling shoulders in the booth. His eyes went straight to the old woman, and the focus in them didn't feel like concern. It felt like retrieval. Sofia felt the room tilt around him, not because he was loud, but because he carried the quiet authority people learned to obey. The garland above the booths swayed slightly in the draft, and the heater hummed as if trying to fill the space his presence emptied. Sofia moved with a calm that surprised even her, placing herself between Julian and the booth the way you stand between a child and a speeding car. "What's her name?" she asked, keeping her tone respectful but steady, like a hand held out to stop something without violence. Julian's gaze flicked to Sofia's name tag, lingering there a fraction too long, as if labeling her made her easier to dismiss. "I'm here to handle a situation," he replied, and the words made the old woman flinch as if she'd heard them before. Julian reached for the old woman's arm with a practiced certainty, neither gentle nor cruel, just automatic, as though permission was assumed. Sofia lifted her hand and stopped him, palm open, not touching him, but making the boundary unmistakable. Her heart beat hard, yet her voice stayed level as she said, "Not until you tell me who you are to her." The refusal landed like a snapped thread, quiet but sharp, and Julian's expression tightened in a way that revealed how unfamiliar the word no was to him. Behind Sofia, the old woman shrank deeper into the blanket, her eyes fixed on Julian with a fear that seemed older than the storm. Julian's strategy shifted the way a man's does when force isn't allowed. He softened his tone and reached for his wallet instead. He offered money with polished ease, as if cash could turn Sofia's conscience into a receipt, as if kindness was something you could reimburse. For one flash of a second, Sofia felt the warmth of temptation. Rent paid, groceries stocked, a month without that constant math in her head. Then she saw the bruise again, faint but undeniable, and the expensive ring shining on a hand that still trembled like it belonged to someone trapped. The old woman whispered a small, raw, "Don't," and Sofia understood the money wasn't gratitude, it was a leash. So Sofia did the one thing Julian hadn't accounted for in a diner on Christmas Eve. She asked for truth instead of taking the offer. "Why is she afraid of you?" she said softly, and the question cut through the cozy decor like a draft that finds every crack. Julian's composure held for a beat, then something in his face shifted, too quick to name, but real enough to chill Sofia's skin. It looked like anger at being challenged, yet underneath it lived something sharper, almost panicked, like a man guarding a door he cannot afford to let open. In that heavy silence, Sofia realized he hadn't come to rescue Evelyn from the blizzard. He'd come to control what she might say once she was warm. Julian didn't raise his voice, but he found a way to make Sofia feel smaller without even trying, like the whole room was supposed to understand its place. He nodded once toward Evelyn and spoke with a careful calm that sounded rehearsed, calling her confused, the way people label a problem they want removed. The words slipped into the air like something clinical, clean and cruel, because it made fear look like nonsense and made control look like care. Sofia felt the sting of it in her chest, not because she doubted what she'd seen, but because she recognized the tactic. It was the kind of quiet cruelty that didn't leave bruises on the speaker, only on the person being spoken about. She swallowed her pride the way she'd learned to do at work, turning it into steadiness instead of letting it become anger Julian could use against her. "Let's all sit down," she said, and guided him toward a nearby table, as if courtesy could slow the moment down and keep it from shattering. She poured coffee with hands that were calmer than her thoughts, buying time with simple, ordinary motions, mug, napkin, sugar packets, like building a small fence out of normal life. If she could keep him talking, keep Evelyn breathing, keep the room from turning into a courtroom, maybe the truth would have space to surface. Julian sat like he owned the chair, but his eyes never stopped tracking the booth. Evelyn's lips moved around words that seemed trapped behind years of fear, and when she finally spoke, it came out thin and trembling, a confession offered to the only person in reach. "I don't want to go back," she whispered, barely louder than the heater, and the plea wasn't dramatic. It was exhausted, like she'd been saying it to walls for a long time. Sofia leaned closer, pretending to adjust the blanket, letting her face soften so Evelyn could borrow calm from it. In Evelyn's eyes, Sofia saw something that had nothing to do with snowstorms, something tighter and more personal, like a door that always locked from the outside. The diner's warm lights made Evelyn look fragile, but her fear made her words feel true. Julian watched them with a patience that didn't match the urgency he claimed to have, and Sofia began noticing details she'd missed in the chaos, how his jaw tightened when Evelyn spoke, how his fingers flexed as if restraining himself. When he shifted his coat, a corner of folded paper flashed from an inner pocket, crisp and neatly stacked, the kind of documents that didn't belong to a spontaneous search in a blizzard. Sofia's stomach sank as she caught the edge of a signature line, the faint geometry of legal formatting, the cold promise of authority printed in black ink. She didn't know what it said, but she knew what it meant. This wasn't just about bringing an elder home safely. This was about bringing her back under something written, signed and enforced. Sofia set the coffee down gently, as if any sudden movement might break what little safety remained, and she felt her choices narrowing like a hallway with doors slamming shut behind her. The money Julian offered earlier now made sense in a darker way, not as gratitude, but as a shortcut around witnesses, around questions, around truth. Evelyn's hands trembled harder, and Sofia noticed how she kept her gaze on Sofia instead of Julian, like a person clinging to the only honest thing in the room. Outside, the storm kept roaring, but inside, another kind of weather was building. Paper-thin civility stretched over something sharp, and as Sofia's eyes flicked once more to the documents hidden in Julian's coat, she understood that whatever he called handling, it wasn't going to end with kindness. Julian turned away from the booth as if the conversation there no longer deserved oxygen, pulling out his phone with the smooth impatience of someone used to delegating discomfort. The screen's pale glow lit the hard planes of his face, while he spoke in short, controlled phrases: security, driver, keep it quiet, words that didn't belong to a medical emergency or a worried family member. Sofia stood by the booth listening, and each clipped syllable made the diner feel colder, as if the storm had found a second way inside. When Julian used the word containment, it landed in her mind like a bruise, because it wasn't the language of care. It was the language of control, and it made Evelyn's trembling look suddenly like a response to something familiar. Sofia glanced at Evelyn and saw the old woman's eyes following Julian's mouth, as if every word could tighten a chain. "She needs a doctor," Sofia said, keeping her tone firm and plain, refusing to let the moment drift into intimidation. Julian barely looked up, only exhaling through his nose with the faint irritation of a man forced to explain something obvious to someone he considered beneath him. He insisted that an ambulance would attract attention, that cameras and reports were unnecessary, and he said it the way you might speak about a stain on a shirt. Sofia felt heat rise under her skin, not loud anger, but the quiet, steady fury of witnessing a life treated like an inconvenience. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, and Sofia thought how honest the storm was compared to the cold politeness in Julian's voice. A couple of late-night regulars watched from the counter, their faces tightened by instinct, sensing the imbalance even without understanding the details. The diner's cozy decorations suddenly looked fragile. Paper snowflakes, strings of lights, cheap tinsel, like a child's attempt to make a safe world in a harsh one. Sofia could feel her own place in that imbalance, could feel how Julian expected her to fold, expected her to take the money, step aside, and let power finish the story without interruption. But she'd spent too many years being spoken over to confuse silence with peace. She had learned that pride could be dangerous, yes, but it could also be a spine. So Sofia did something simple and almost reckless. She asked a human question in a room that wanted her to speak in obedient ones. "Why is she afraid of you?" she said, not accusing, just holding the truth up where it could be seen. The words hung there between them, heavier than the storm, and for a moment Julian didn't answer at all. His face tightened, a muscle jumping in his jaw, and the air around him changed from polished to sharp. The crack in his composure was brief, but Sofia saw it clearly, something like guilt trying to stay hidden behind authority, something like fear dressed as anger. Julian's eyes hardened as he finally looked directly at Sofia, and she could feel the pressure behind that stare, the weight of a world that punished people for refusing to cooperate. He spoke carefully, warning her not to misread the situation, implying she was naive, implying she didn't understand what she was stepping into. Sofia's hands stayed still, but her heart beat loud, and she realized she wasn't just protecting Evelyn anymore. She was protecting the right to tell the truth. In the warm light of Christmas decor, she felt the distance between their worlds, like a canyon, and yet she also felt something stronger than distance. The certainty that decency mattered most when it was inconvenient. And as the storm clawed at the diner's windows, Sofia understood that Julian wasn't only trying to take Evelyn, he was trying to take the story too. Evelyn's breathing changed first, turning shallow and uneven, as if the diner's warmth had suddenly become too small to hold the panic rising inside her. She tried to push herself up from the booth with trembling hands, the blankets slipping down her shoulders, soup forgotten and cooling on the table like an abandoned comfort. Sofia reached out instinctively, catching her elbow before her knees could betray her, and for a second Evelyn leaned into her like a child who had run too far from home. The lights above them flickered slightly when the wind struck the building again, and the whole room seemed to tilt toward the door, as if the storm and the man had synchronized into one threat. Sofia whispered that she was okay, that she could sit, that she was safe. But Evelyn's eyes had already gone somewhere else. Julian stepped forward the moment Evelyn moved, his body reacting with the certainty of someone who believes he has the right to intervene. Sofia shifted again, half shielding, half supporting, trying to keep Evelyn upright without letting Julian's hand close around her. The air between them tightened with a pressure that made the garland overhead look fragile, a decoration in a room that had stopped being festive. Evelyn's gaze locked on Julian's face, and something in her expression sharpened through the fear, like a memory cutting through fog. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't the thin whisper from before. It was suddenly clear, trembling with a lifetime of restraint finally breaking. She said a name that didn't sound like Julian at all, but like a boy from long ago, and the diner went silent, as if the building itself recognized it. Don't finish it," Evelyn pleaded, and the words hit Sofia like ice water because they didn't belong to a harmless misunderstanding. They belonged to a story with a beginning and a pattern, a story that had been running for years without witnesses brave enough to speak. Julian's face hardened so quickly it was almost a mask snapping into place, and yet Sofia caught something underneath. Panic, hot and immediate, like a man watching a door swing open to a room he's kept locked. The regulars at the counter stopped moving, and even the coffee machine seemed louder in the hush, sputtering and clicking like nervous punctuation. Sofia's arms tightened around Evelyn, feeling how light she was, how breakable, and how determined fear could be. In the distance, faint but rising, Sofia heard a siren cutting through the storm, its rhythm growing clearer as it pushed toward them. Relief should have followed that sound, but Julian's posture changed, blocking the path Evelyn would have to take, as if he could physically intercept the consequences. He spoke quickly now, insisting he would take responsibility, promising private care, private transport, private solutions, anything that kept this out of records and out of sight. Sofia felt her options narrowing into a single corridor, and at the end of it stood the same moral choice her mother had always warned her about, the moment when doing the right thing becomes costly. She looked at Evelyn's bruised wrist, at her terrified eyes, at Julian's controlled urgency, and she knew that silence would be easier, but it would also be a betrayal. The siren grew louder, and Sofia's heart made its decision before her fear could argue. With her phone already in hand, Sofia turned slightly away and spoke into it with steady clarity, letting every word land where Julian could hear it. She gave the address, described the condition, and then, when the operator asked if the patient was safe, Sofia told the truth in plain language, the kind that couldn't be smoothed over later. The diner felt suddenly too bright, too exposed, as if honesty had turned on every light in the room at once. Julian's eyes snapped to her, and the look he gave wasn't simple anger. It was the cold recognition of a man realizing control had slipped through his fingers. As the siren wailed closer and closer, Sofia understood she hadn't just called for help. She had placed herself on the wrong side of a powerful secret, and Julian Hart now knew her name. When the paramedics finally arrived, they brought more than a stretcher and bright medical bags. They brought harsh light, official voices, and the kind of attention Julian had been trying to keep outside. The diner doors opened and closed in quick bursts, letting in slices of freezing wind that made the Christmas lights tremble and the garland sway like it was frightened too. Sofia walked alongside Evelyn as they guided her carefully onto the stretcher, holding the old woman's hand the way you hold someone back from falling into a dark place. Evelyn's fingers clung to hers with surprising strength, and her eyes, still wide, begged Sofia not to disappear. Sofia promised she wouldn't, even though she didn't know what that promise would cost. Julian stepped back as the paramedics moved with practiced urgency, and for a moment he looked like a man forced to watch the world obey rules he couldn't rewrite. He spoke to them with polite authority, trying to slide his version of the story into their ears, but the lead medic kept asking direct questions that refused to soften. Sofia answered when asked, her voice steady even as her stomach twisted, because truth felt like the only solid ground left under her feet. Julian's gaze stayed on her, sharp and measuring, and Sofia could almost feel him memorizing her face, her posture, her refusal. When the stretcher rolled toward the door, Evelyn turned her head and whispered something Sofia barely caught, a breath-thin sound that felt like warning and gratitude at once. Then the ambulance swallowed her into its bright interior, and the doors closed with a finality that made Sofia's chest tighten. After the siren faded into the blizzard, the diner felt suddenly too empty, as if all the warmth had been carried away with Evelyn. Sofia stood behind the counter, staring at the abandoned booth where the soup sat cold, its surface filmed over, steam gone like hope that had slipped out unnoticed. Her hands moved automatically, wiped the table, gathered the blanket, straightened the napkins, but her mind refused to follow the familiar routine. Outside, the storm still roared, yet inside, the loudest sound was the silence Julian left behind, because he didn't linger to argue or threaten in public. He simply walked out with the same controlled steps he'd arrived with, as if he'd decided this battle would be fought somewhere quieter. The door chimed when he left, and the little sound felt wrong, cheerful in a room that had stopped believing in cheer. Sofia locked the door earlier than she ever had, sliding the bolt into place with a click that didn't bring relief. The glass trembled under wind, and her reflection stared back at her, apron, tired eyes, a face that suddenly looked older. She thought of her rent due soon, of her boss who hated trouble, of how quickly a job could vanish when someone powerful decided you were inconvenient. She imagined Julian's world, lawyers, security, phone calls made in warm offices, while people like her scraped ice off car windows and prayed their engines would start. The fear came in waves, not dramatic, but steady, like water rising in a room while you pretend not to notice. And underneath that fear lived a quieter question that hurt more. What if doing the right thing didn't protect you at all? When Sofia finally sat alone in the booth where Evelyn had been, she folded the blanket in her lap like a fragile thing that needed care. The Christmas lights above her blinked softly, stubbornly bright, and she found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't planned, asking not for money or miracles, but for courage to stay honest tomorrow. She knew Julian would return in some form, if not with threats, then with offers wrapped in politeness, the kind that made you doubt your own reality. She pictured Evelyn's terrified eyes and felt anger rise again, not sharp but steady, the kind that anchors you when the world tries to push you off the truth. The heater hummed, the storm howled, and Sofia realized that some blizzards didn't end when the snow stopped. They ended only when someone refused to be moved. Yet Sofia couldn't shake the feeling that tonight she had saved a life, and in return she had invited a war into her own. Sofia didn't remember the drive to the hospital so much as the way the world looked while she made it. Streetlights swallowed by blowing snow, empty intersections, and the steady sweep of her wipers fighting a losing battle. The closer she got, the more her hands tightened on the steering wheel, as if grip alone could hold her courage together. Inside the car, the heater worked hard, but the cold she felt wasn't coming from outside anymore. It lived in the thought of Julian's eyes on her, in the certainty that powerful people didn't like loose ends, and in the fear that she had just become one. Still, she kept going, because Evelyn's hand on hers had felt like a promise she couldn't abandon. The hospital lobby was bright, in a way the diner never was, all polished floors and fluorescent calm, a place where the world tried to pretend it could control pain with procedures. Sofia checked in with a shaky voice and gave Evelyn's name, expecting to be brushed aside, but something shifted when the nurse at the desk looked up. The nurse's expression tightened with recognition, subtle, quick, and heavy, like a person who had seen this story pass through these doors before. "Evelyn Hart," she repeated, and the way she said it wasn't curiosity, it was concern wrapped in professionalism. Sofia felt her stomach drop because recognition meant pattern, and pattern meant this wasn't an accident of one terrible night. A few minutes later, a social worker approached, not hurried but purposeful, with a clipboard held like a shield and eyes that actually listened. She led Sofia to a quieter corner and asked simple questions in a gentle voice that made it harder to lie to herself. Sofia described the blizzard, the tremors, the bruise, the documents in Julian's pocket, and the way Evelyn had reacted like a frightened child at the sound of his name. The social worker wrote everything down without flinching, and when Sofia hesitated, ashamed of how small she felt next to money and power, the woman nodded as if to say that size didn't decide truth. "You did the right thing," she told Sofia, not as praise but as a steady fact that anchored the room. Sofia breathed out a fraction of the weight she'd been carrying, surprised by how much she needed to hear that. When Sofia was finally allowed to see Evelyn, the old woman looked smaller against the white sheets, her hair brushed back, her skin warmed by clean blankets and monitored by quiet machines. But her eyes were clearer now, less fogged by cold, and when she saw Sofia, a soft sound escaped her, like relief she'd stopped believing in. She reached out, and Sofia took her hand again, feeling the pulse there, real, steady, stubborn, proof that life had chosen to stay. Evelyn's fingers curled around hers with strength that didn't match her age, and she whispered, "You were the first who didn't sell me," the words trembling as if they'd waited years to be spoken. Sofia swallowed hard, because the sentence carried a whole history inside it, attempts, bargains, silences, and the loneliness of being treated like a thing. Sofia left the room with her heart bruised but steadier, as if hope had finally found a place to sit. In the hallway, she glanced at the nurse's station and saw a note being added to Evelyn's chart, the kind that looked routine until you understood it could become protection. Observations, triggers, instructions about visitors. The social worker met Sofia's eyes again and promised that everything would be documented properly, that there were protocols for vulnerable patients, that hospitals weren't only for bodies, they were for boundaries too. Sofia wanted to believe that paper could stand up to a billionaire, that systems could hold when money pressed against them. As she watched the snow whirl beyond the hospital windows, she felt hope rise, fragile, cautious, real. Yet a quiet dread followed close behind, because if Evelyn had been here before, then someone had always brought her back, and Sofia had just made sure this time there would be witnesses. Christmas morning arrived without softness, the sky still heavy and white, the city still muffled as if the storm had put a hand over everyone's mouth. Sofia walked back into the hospital with the same coat she'd worn the night before, but she felt like a different person inside it. Tired in a deeper way, alert in a way that wouldn't turn off. The lobby was decorated with a modest tree and plastic poinsettias, the kind of holiday cheer that looked brave under fluorescent lights. Families moved through with paper cups of coffee and whispered prayers, and for a few minutes Sofia let herself believe she could blend into the ordinary. Then the air shifted, the way it does before a door opens, to someone who expects the world to make room. Julian Hart entered with the precision of a man used to being awaited, not questioned, his security a step behind him, and a lawyer at his side, carrying a briefcase like a weapon dressed in leather. Conversations lowered as he passed, heads turning with that instinctive respect people offer wealth before they even know why. Sofia watched it happen and felt a familiar sting. How easily power rewrites the rules of a room, how quickly it makes everyone else careful. Julian's face was as controlled as it had been in the diner, but daylight made him look even more untouchable, as if the night had been a small inconvenience he'd already filed away. He didn't scan for Evelyn first. He scanned for obstacles, and when his eyes found Sofia near the corridor, the smallest flicker crossed his expression. Recognition, not gratitude. It was the look of a man spotting the one variable he hadn't planned for. At the nurse's station, Julian spoke in a low, confident tone, producing documents with an ease that suggested they'd been prepared long before the blizzard began. The lawyer opened the folder and pointed to lines and signatures, explaining care arrangements and legal authority, as if human beings were simply assets requiring management. Sofia listened from a few feet away, the words washing over her like cold water: guardianship, medical decisions, private transport, language that sounded responsible until you heard it beside Evelyn's fear. A nurse hesitated, glancing at the chart, and Sofia saw the moment professionalism collided with unease. Julian smiled politely, the kind of smile that offered no warmth, only certainty, and he repeated a phrase about family matters, as if it should seal every doubt. Sofia's name was called because her statement was now part of the record, and she stepped forward with her pulse hammering, feeling suddenly exposed in her worn shoes and simple coat. Julian turned toward her as if he'd been waiting for this, his eyes steady, his voice quiet enough to sound reasonable. He thanked her, briefly, formally, and then, without changing his tone, asked what exactly she had told the staff, as if the truth were a detail to be corrected. Sofia answered carefully, refusing to exaggerate, refusing to shrink, stating only what she had witnessed: Evelyn's condition, her fear, her plea not to go back, the bruise, the panic. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the lawyer's pen paused, as if even writing her words down felt inconvenient. Sofia realized she wasn't just recounting events anymore, she was resisting a rewrite, and then Julian made it clear why he had returned in daylight. Not to comfort Evelyn, but to control the story before it hardened into fact. His gaze held Sofia's with a calm that felt like pressure, like a hand closing around a fragile thing without leaving fingerprints. The lobby's Christmas tree glittered behind him, lights blinking softly, indifferent to what was happening beneath them. Sofia could feel the temptation of quiet compliance hovering nearby, the easy path of stepping back and letting powerful people do what they always did. But she remembered Evelyn's whispered sentence, "You were the first who didn't sell me," and it rang inside her like a bell that wouldn't stop. As Julian's lawyer began to speak again about next steps, Sofia understood with a tightening certainty that Julian hadn't come to thank her at all. He had come to make sure she never spoke again. The hospital corridors were quieter than the lobby, quieter than the lawyer's crisp pages and Julian's calm insistence, and Sofia clung to that quiet, like a rail you hold when your legs feel unsteady. A nurse guided her to a small waiting room near Evelyn's wing, where the lights were softer and the decorations looked tired, paper snowflakes taped to glass, a tiny nativity scene on a side table. Sofia sat with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles ached, listening to the distant beep of monitors and the muted shuffle of shoes. Every few minutes she glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Julian to appear again, to remind her with a look that people like him didn't lose what they came for. Yet the longer she sat there, the more she realized the hospital wasn't only a place of medicine. It was a place of records, of witnesses, of lines you couldn't simply step over without leaving evidence behind. When she was finally allowed back into Evelyn's room, the old woman looked more awake than she had the night before, her cheeks warmed by clean blankets and steady heat instead of desperate soup steam. Her eyes found Sofia immediately, and that recognition carried something gentler now, fear still there, but threaded with relief, as if the simple fact of Sofia returning proved the world hadn't entirely abandoned her. Sofia pulled a chair close and took Evelyn's hand, careful not to squeeze too hard, careful not to treat her like something breakable that might crack under kindness. "They're saying he has papers," Sofia murmured, keeping her voice low, the way you speak around sleeping pain. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the door, and for a moment her fingers tightened around Sofia's like a warning bell. "He always has papers," Evelyn said, and the bitterness in her voice didn't match her frail body at all. It sounded like someone who had lived too long inside other people's signatures. She swallowed, staring at the ceiling as if the truth was written there, and then she began to speak in fragments that stitched together into something heavier than Sofia expected. "There had once been a boy," Evelyn said, "a gentle boy who used to sit at her kitchen table and talk about the kind of man he wanted to be. Then money arrived, and with it the lesson that love could be managed, controlled, reshaped into something useful. She spoke of a winter long ago, of an accident and a choice made afterward, a choice that turned grief into secrecy and secrecy into power. Sofia didn't know all the details, but she felt the shape of them, like a shadow behind a door, something Julian had been building his life around, something he could not afford to let crumble. Sofia leaned closer when Evelyn's voice dropped even lower, and the old woman's eyes filled with tears that didn't spill, held back by sheer exhaustion. "I ran because he was coming again," Evelyn whispered, "with papers again." The sentence landed in Sofia's chest like a stone, because it made the blizzard feel almost secondary, a stage set for a struggle that had been happening for years. Sofia looked at Evelyn's bruised wrist and suddenly understood how easy it would be for a powerful person to call fear confusion and control care, and how hard it would be for anyone to prove otherwise once the doors closed. Evelyn's breath trembled, as if she was deciding whether to trust Sofia with something dangerous. Then, with a small, shaky motion, she slid her hand beneath the blanket and pressed something into Sofia's palm. It was a tiny key, cold at first, then warming quickly against Sofia's skin, and with it a wrinkled paper bearing an address written in careful, older handwriting. Evelyn's eyes held Sofia's with a desperate clarity that cut through all the hospital calm. "If anything happens," she said, voice cracking on the words, "go there. Don't let him erase it." Sofia stared at the key as if it were impossibly heavy, because in that small piece of metal she could feel the weight of what Julian feared. Proof, memory, truth that couldn't be bribed into silence. She tucked the key into her pocket like a fragile spark and folded the paper tight, her hands trembling now despite her efforts. And as she looked back at Evelyn, small in the bed but fierce in her plea, Sofia realized she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was holding the first piece of something Julian Hart could not buy back. Sofia left Evelyn's room with the tiny key burning like a secret in her pocket, and the hallway suddenly felt longer than it had a minute ago. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright and too honest, making every shadow look sharper on the floor. She tried to walk like a normal visitor, but her heartbeat kept stumbling as if it knew someone was waiting. Near a quiet corridor by the vending machines, she felt the air change, the way it had changed in the diner when the door slammed open. When she turned, Julian Hart was there, blocking the path with calm that didn't belong to Christmas morning. He didn't touch her, didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten her in words that could be reported, but he still made the space feel smaller. His eyes moved over her face as if searching for cracks, for the soft spot where fear would win. "You meant well," he said, the phrase delivered like a compliment and a warning at the same time. Then he began naming things the way people like him did. Tuition, a better apartment, a paid-off car, a clean start, each offer placed gently on the table as if it were mercy. He spoke as though generosity could rewrite what Sofia had seen, as though money could turn terror into misunderstanding. And beneath every polished sentence sat one unspoken condition, heavy and unmistakable. Silence. For a moment, Sofia felt the warmth of it, the dangerous comfort of imagining her life without constant strain. She saw her landlord's angry messages disappearing, her fridge full, her shoulders unclenching for the first time in years. She hated herself for how quickly her mind tried to make peace with the offer, for how survival could make even a good person feel tired of fighting. Then she pictured Evelyn's hands trembling around that bowl of soup, the bruise on her wrist, the way her eyes had begged Sofia not to leave. Sofia felt the key in her pocket like a heartbeat of truth, and temptation began to taste like betrayal. She realized Julian wasn't offering help. He was offering an exit from conscience. Sofia lifted her eyes to his and steadied her voice the way she steadied coffee cups on crowded trays, slow and deliberate. "If you really wanted to make this right," she said softly, "you wouldn't be negotiating in a hallway." Julian's expression tightened, the polite mask holding for a second before strain showed at the edges. He leaned in just enough to make his presence feel unavoidable, and his tone grew even calmer, the calm of someone who had ended problems with paperwork for a long time. Sofia didn't step back, even though every instinct told her to, because she understood that fear was the tool he expected to work. "I can't be bought," she finished, and the words landed between them like a locked door. Julian held her gaze, and for the briefest moment his control cracked, revealing something raw underneath, panic dressed up as authority. It wasn't only anger in his eyes. It was the look of a man protecting a story that could collapse if one ordinary person refused to cooperate. Sofia felt chilled by how quickly his face smoothed again, how practiced he was at turning emotion back into composure. He straightened, adjusting his cuff as if the conversation had been about schedules instead of souls, and his voice lowered to a final, careful line that sounded almost kind. Sofia walked away with her legs steady and her stomach twisting, knowing she had just refused a lifeline made of money and accepted a burden made of truth. And as the corridor swallowed the distance between them, she couldn't shake the feeling that Julian wasn't afraid of losing Evelyn. He was afraid of what Evelyn could finally reveal. Sofia didn't unfold the wrinkled address until the day had begun to fade, as if nightfall could hide her from the weight of what she was about to do. The city still looked stunned from the blizzard. Snowbanks piled like quiet barricades, streets scraped down to grey slush, Christmas lights blinking bravely against all that white. She walked with her shoulders hunched against the cold, one hand buried in her coat pocket, fingers curled around the tiny key that had warmed to her skin. She kept telling herself she was only honoring an old woman's request, only doing what was necessary to keep Evelyn safe. But the steady drum of her heart knew better. She was stepping toward the part of the story Julian Hart had spent years trying to lock away. The address led her to a plain building that smelled faintly of radiator heat and old paper, the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. Inside, everything was quiet. Muted footsteps, low voices, the soft scrape of drawers sliding open and shut, like the building had been designed to swallow secrets politely. Sofia signed her name with a pen that felt too light for what it asked of her, and when the clerk returned with a small metal box, her breath caught. The key turned with a gentle click, almost tender, and for a second she hesitated, afraid that opening it would change her life in a way she couldn't undo. Then the lid lifted, and the world inside that box rose to meet her like a buried winter memory finally exposed to air. What she found wasn't a single dramatic confession, but something far more chilling. A trail. There were documents folded crisp and careful, language that sounded respectable until you read it with Evelyn's trembling hands in your mind. Phrases about care and authority that tightened into cages when placed in the wrong hands. There were records of transfers, notes from private offices, and a pattern that made Sofia's stomach sink because it felt practiced, not accidental. And there, tucked among it all, were letters written in a neat, controlled handwriting, Julian's pages that carried regret like a bruise under a clean shirt. Some lines sounded like apology, some like justification, and none of it felt like love. It felt like a man trying to keep a single terrible choice from ever catching up to him. Sofia left with the file held tight against her ribs, as if paper could slip away if she loosened her grip. She didn't go to Julian because she understood now that confronting power alone was how people vanished from the story. Instead, she returned to the hospital and asked for the social worker by name, her voice shaking just enough to betray how hard she was holding herself together. When the social worker read the first pages, her expression changed from gentle concern to focused purpose, the kind that belonged to someone trained to protect the vulnerable when money tried to bend rules. Administration was called in, notes were added to Evelyn's chart, and suddenly the hallway outside Evelyn's room felt different, less like a place Julian owned, and more like a place with boundaries he couldn't simply step over. Sofia sat beside Evelyn afterward and watched the old woman's eyes fill, not with triumph but with exhausted relief, as if truth was finally being allowed to breathe. When Julian arrived later, he walked in with the same controlled posture, the same expensive calm, but the air didn't move for him the way it had before. People watched him differently, carefully, alertly, and even his lawyer's confidence seemed to dull under the weight of official attention. Julian's eyes found Sofia, and for the first time he didn't look at her like a nuisance that could be paid off. He looked at her like a person who had altered the ground beneath his feet. He asked quietly why she would risk her job, her safety, her entire fragile life for an old woman she'd met in a storm. Sofia didn't raise her voice, didn't perform bravery. She simply told him the simplest truth she had left. She said, "Because she's a person." And in the silence that followed, Julian's face tightened, as if he'd been forced to look into a mirror he'd avoided for years. And whatever he chose next would decide whether this story ended in ruin or in redemption. In the days that followed, the city began to thaw, but Sofia didn't feel the relief she expected, because not all cold comes from snow. The hospital kept its lights bright and its routines steady, yet Sofia walked its corridors as if she were carrying something fragile in her chest, something that could crack if she relaxed. Evelyn stayed under protective care, surrounded by professionals who spoke gently and wrote everything down. And for the first time, Sofia saw what safety looked like when it was backed by rules, not money. Julian's visits became controlled, observed and limited, and every time he appeared in the hallway, his confidence looked a little less absolute. He still dressed like a headline, but now the building didn't bend for him the way it had before. Then on a grey afternoon close enough to Christmas to still smell like pine in the lobby, Julian made a choice that startled everyone who had been watching him. He withdrew the legal pressure, stepped back from the authority he had waved like a weapon, and signed papers that did the opposite of what he'd come to do. There was no dramatic speech, no tearful performance, only a quiet shift that felt almost painful in its restraint, like a man forcing his own hands to open after years clenched shut. A program was announced in Evelyn's name, aimed at elder protection and oversight, the kind of public act that could be criticized as damage control, yet it still placed real resources where they mattered. Sofia didn't know whether to trust it, because she'd learned that power could apologize and still keep its advantage, but she couldn't deny the simplest truth. The grip was loosening. Privately, Julian sat by Evelyn's bed in a way that didn't fit the man Sofia had met in the diner. His shoulders were lower, his voice smaller, and when he spoke, he sounded like someone walking barefoot over broken glass. He apologized, not with excuses, but with the raw acknowledgement of harm, words that didn't erase the past, but finally stopped pretending it was harmless. Evelyn listened without rushing to comfort him, her eyes steady, her hands still, as if forgiveness was something sacred you didn't hand out to make someone else feel better. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a blessing or a punishment, it was a request that cut straight through money and image. She told him to stop treating love like a transaction, to stop using papers to replace presents, and Julian's face tightened as if that simple sentence hurt more than any scandal. Sofia should have felt peace then, yet life had a way of collecting its own debts. One evening, she returned to the diner to pick up her last paycheck, only to find her boss pacing behind the counter with a pinched face and a stack of notices in his hand. The building was being sold, he said, and the new owners might not keep staff, might not keep anything except the location and the profit. Sofia stared at the familiar booths, the strings of lights she'd hung with her own hands, and felt the floor tilt under her like it had the night the door slammed open. She had done the right thing, and still the world was rearranging around her without asking permission. For a moment, bitterness rose in her throat, sharp and hot, because it felt like kindness had carved her life apart and left her with nothing but principles. That night, Sofia stood outside the diner under softly falling snow, the sign glowing faintly above her, the windows reflecting her tired face back at her. She thought of Evelyn's hand gripping hers, of the key warming in her pocket, of the truth she'd carried like a lantern through a storm that wanted her silent. She wondered if decency was always this expensive, if doing the right thing meant paying with the very stability you were trying to protect. The street was quiet, and the snow fell gently now, almost tender, as if the city wanted to apologize for what it had put her through. Sofia hugged her coat closer and took a slow breath, trying to believe there was still a path forward, even if she couldn't see it yet. And in that quiet, uncertain glow, she realized the storm might be ending for Evelyn and Julian, but for her, the hardest part was only beginning. Sofia didn't sleep much that night, not because the diner might be sold, but because her mind kept replaying the same cruel logic the world loved to teach. Do the right thing, and you still might be punished for it. In the morning she showed up anyway, apron tied, hair pinned back, moving through the familiar motions like a prayer she refused to abandon. The booths were the same. The coffee still hissed and dripped. The bell over the door still chimed like nothing had changed, yet Sofia felt as if she were working inside a goodbye. She smiled at the few customers who braved the cold, refilled cups, wiped counters, and kept her voice steady, because pride sometimes looked like showing up, even when your heart was tired. But every time she glanced at the window, she expected to see another notice, another loss, another reminder that kindness didn't pay bills. Near midday, the bell chimed again, and the entire diner seemed to pause, not because the newcomer was loud, but because the air changed in a way Sofia recognized too well. Julian Hart stepped inside without security, without a lawyer, dressed simply for him yet still unmistakably expensive, his presence turning heads before he said a word. Sofia's body tensed automatically, a warning running through her like cold water, and for a moment she hated herself for still being afraid. Julian didn't stride toward the booth or scan the room like a man claiming territory. He walked slowly, eyes lowered, as if he had come to enter a place he hadn't earned. When he reached the counter, he asked for Sofia by name, but this time his voice didn't carry command. It carried something careful, almost restrained, like he was learning a language he'd never needed before. He didn't start with apologies or speeches. He placed a folder on the counter and slid it toward her with deliberate slowness, giving her the space to choose whether she would even touch it. Inside were purchase documents, but the words that mattered weren't legal. They were simple. The diner would remain open, the staff would stay, wages would rise, and Sofia would not be kept on like a favor, but offered ownership, or at the very least a partnership that protected her dignity. Julian spoke quietly, eyes fixed on the countertop, as if meeting her gaze would be too much honesty at once, and he admitted that he had almost used money the way he always had, to silence, to control, to erase. He said he couldn't undo what he'd done to Evelyn, but he could stop making the same kind of choice, and this place, this warm, ordinary diner, was where someone had finally forced him to see what he'd become. Sofia listened with her throat tight, not trusting the gentleness yet, because she had learned that power could dress itself in kindness and still keep its advantage. Sofia asked the only question that mattered to her, the one that had nothing to do with numbers. She asked what would happen to the people who worked here, the cook who sent half his paycheck to family, the older cashier who couldn't afford a gap in income, the teenagers saving for community college. Julian's answer came without hesitation, and that steadiness was the first thing that sounded real. They would stay, all of them, and the changes would not be temporary. He said he would put it in writing in ways that couldn't be quietly undone later, and Sofia watched him sign where he needed to sign without turning it into a performance. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Sofia felt her shoulders loosen, not into joy, but into something like safety, returning inch by inch. She didn't forgive Julian for Evelyn's pain. She wasn't the one who had the right to do that, but she recognized the difference between a bribe and a repair. A week later, Evelyn came to the diner in daylight, wrapped in a bright scarf, walking slowly but steadily, accompanied by a nurse who smiled like someone who had finally seen a patient breathe freely. The moment Evelyn stepped inside, the diner's warmth seemed to deepen, as if the place recognized her, as the reason had become more than a job. Sofia guided her to the same booth and set down a bowl of soup, not because Evelyn needed saving now, but because some symbols deserved to stay. Julian arrived later and stood by the counter, not taking over the room, only watching quietly, and when Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes held caution, but also a tired kind of openness. She didn't offer instant forgiveness. She offered a chance, which was sometimes the harder mercy, and Julian accepted it without demanding more. Sofia watched them in the glow of hanging lights, while snow drifted softly outside, and she understood that redemption wasn't a single grand moment. It was 100 small choices repeated until they became real. By the next Christmas Eve, the diner stayed open just a little longer again, not for profit, but for the possibility that someone might need a light in the storm. Sofia moved through the room with a quieter confidence now, not because life had become perfect, but because she had learned what her kindness could do when she refused to bargain it away. The garlands still hung, the bell still chimed, and the world outside still carried its share of cold, but inside there was a warmth that wasn't just heat. It was dignity protected, a vulnerable life kept safe, and a powerful man finally learning that love could not be written into law. And if this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.